Welcome to the Stoa. The Stoa is a digital campfire where we cohere and dialogue about what matters most at the knife's edge of what's happening now.
Begin. Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Stoa. The Stoa is a digital campfire where we cohere and dialogue about what matters most at the knife's edge of what's happening now. My name is Raven, and I'm your host for the evening. So we're going to begin with an interview with Aella and Hrothgar, who are the founders of a game that we've been playing with here, Askhole. And so what we're going to do is a Q&A with me and Aella and Hrothgar, and then we'll move after 20 minutes to the audience questions. So if you have a question that comes up while we are doing our interview, you can go ahead and put it in the chat, and during the question and answer period, I will facilitate the questions. So today we have Aella and Hrothgar. Would you all like to speak to us about what is Askhole? Tell us about this game.
Askhole is a game of questions. Basically questions designed after a whole bunch of research to figure out what is most likely to be divisive, to generate the most conversation, and also filtered by ones that we personally like too. So that's a general summary. So I'm guessing probably all of you have played it. Has anybody not played it here?
Probably quite a few people haven't, yeah. So like there's a couple different versions. There's the like physical version that I have, which looks like this. It comes in this lovely little box, and it has like so many questions in here. Like there's just hundreds. How many questions are there, Aella?
125.
125 questions. They come in different categories. Do you want to talk about the different categories of the questions?
Yeah, so let's see if I can remember them. There is a generic personal question set. There's romantic, controversial and taboo, intellectual and philosophical, and sex and romance. And those categories sort of came up after I would have these questions on the floor, and Hrothgar helped also, is like just kind of naturally binning them into whatever seemed right. And we tried this like multiple times, and these same bins kept emerging of like these sorts of categories. Oh wait, sad. Did I say sad? I heard. There's also
sad. Yeah, there's sad too.
Okay.
Yeah. So you said that this is like the culmination of years of you experimenting with these questions. Can you talk about like the very early days, like proto Askhole, before it was even conceived as a game? Where did the kernel of this idea begin?
Yeah, so Twitter polls, basically. I don't know if any of you follow me on Twitter, but I'm like a really obsessive Twitter poller. I've tweeted, I don't know, maybe 1,500 polls at this point, which I have recorded in a spreadsheet over the course of maybe 4 years, I think. And so I would just obsessively write down these questions and get responses. And then I would start to go to parties and then realize actually it might be good if I could bring some of these questions into parties. So I would start writing these questions down. And eventually this transitioned into like having little pieces of paper cut out with the questions on them. And so I just had this stack, it was really big stack. At this point, I think it was like 500 questions. We ended up chiseling it down a lot for Askhole. And I would just like carry them around to parties all the time. And then eventually people started saying, I would buy this. Like if you were selling this as a product, I would buy it. And then that got me thinking. And then I was hanging out with Hrothgar for a while. And then Hrothgar was like, he really loved it. And he's like, you know, I am down for helping make this a reality. So.
Yeah. So why did you need questions, and why did you start asking Twitter polls in the first place? Why did you need questions to go to parties with? What's the deal?
Do other people not need questions to go to parties? Like, I don't.
They need beers. They drink beers.
Well, I need beers and questions.
And questions.
I don't understand. People just go to parties and then they're like, "What are we doing now?" You go and you find someone. And then you talk to them for what purpose? What are you doing? Like, are you trying to like most efficiently find someone who you want to like be your best friend? If so, you should like know what your goal is and then optimize the amount of questions to learn that. So like my approach to parties is like very like, how do we maximize the enjoyment and like the kind of connection I want to find from this party is my personal goal. I think Hrothgar might have a slightly different do you want to say your relationship to this?
Well, I really liked I really liked the concept from the first times that I saw it. And I was around when Askhole was in the testing phase, where it was like printed on or like handwritten on cards and brought to parties. And I just saw the effect it had on people. I think a really well-crafted question is like the antidote to having a strong opinion about something, where really good questions can crack people open. They can illuminate the places where we've assumed things. And then in the context of a party or some kind of social space where people are already sharing and discovering each other, it just seems like a really powerful tool. So
Yeah, I also feel like, and maybe this is a weird, quirky, like rationality thing, but people like not answering questions like, where are you from? You know, and just being like, no, I'm not going to answer that question. I want to have more interesting, engaging conversation with people that isn't based around like your job or like where you live, or like these very basic facts about who you are, but rather getting into your like opinions and belief and like controversy and intimacy. And I think that this game also reminds me of Hot Seat, which was something that we played in the Seattle rationality kind of golden age. Do you want to talk about like the rationality community and its connection to this game?
Yeah, I don't know, what is the familiarity people have with the rationality community?
Let's assume low.
Okay, so the rationality community is a bunch of people who read a set of blogs, is kind of how it started. Like Less Wrong, or lately it's been Slate Star Codex, stuff like that. And then meet up and then have like specific kinds of conversations with like certain standards of communication, which I find extremely appealing. It's like very clear, and we're like actually here to understand what the other person means, not to have this like weird little war with words where we're trying to prove our point. So I really, really value that. And they also have like a bunch of like norms around, we're also going to have the most efficient conversations possible. And so like a lot of the like original question testing was done in the rationality community.
Yeah, and there's a kind of idea there of intimacy hacking. Could you talk a little bit about that?
I actually don't know specifically what that term refers to.
Okay, yeah. So I always thought of it as being in relationship to the game, like Hot Seat, where like basically you all agree on some sort of structure, some sort of game that puts everyone in a position of being extremely vulnerable to the group and to being honest and answering personal questions. And I see that this game also kind of has that effect, right? Because you're really digging into what is like juicy. There's like controversial questions, both political, sexual, there's questions about faith and all sorts of taboos. And that really digs into parts of social interaction that are typically in the shadows. So I don't know if you...
I have this belief that everybody actually wants to be asked these questions. Like a lot of people say they won't, and it's not a norm in social circles, but like it's this really deep perspective of the world that I think that people want to be prodded in like the most terrifying and uncomfortable places. Like, what are we doing if not like searching for the thing that hasn't been seen yet?
Mm-hmm. So can you talk about some of your favorite questions and maybe some of your least favorite questions in the game?
Rothgar, do you want to go first?
Yeah, Rothgar.
Now I have to remember all the questions. So broadly, I think my favorite category is the sad category. Maybe I just like being sad, but I don't know if they're in order. I don't know if I can recall specific questions, but in what ways don't you trust yourself? In what ways are you? Yeah, I'm listing also ones I came up with that made it into the game. So that's why I remember them, and maybe why I like
That's this one.
Yeah, so I like this question. Have you been loved enough? Yeah, so that whole category has a flavor that I really like, and when I'm brainstorming, somehow I tend towards that category.
Cool.
Least favorite. I don't know if I could say least favorite. These are the 125 best questions out of like over 1,000, so or something. So.
Aella, what about you? What are some of the questions that pop out for you?
I think my favorite, so the one that I end up pulling out like from memory whenever I'm in a group but I don't have my deck with me is like what how is it phrased? Like, what opinion do you hold as the most controversial among your peers or something? I feel like that tells you so much about a person in like such a fast way. And it's like not too scary that people will like put up too many walls like compared to some of the other ones. And it's like personal enough that it really gets you to know something about them. That's my go-to.
Actually, I have more answers.
Yeah, let's hear 'em.
So I really like the question, which of your habits conflicts with your values? And I also really like the question, is bestiality wrong? Are you a vegan? It's on the same card. And I think Aella came up with this. It's just brilliant.
Yeah, I like that one.
Brilliant.
Well, that one, I think actually, didn't you do that one as a Twitter poll?
Yeah.
How did that go?
Well, I've tweeted it a few times over the years. I usually will tweet things about once a year to see like change over time. Yeah, people don't like it. People don't really like their eating meat being equated to bestiality. If I could press a button and then have it, all of the meat eaters instead switch to being bestiality people, I would do that.
That's also a technique that you use. So yeah, let's turn to kind of the technique that you use in some of these questions, or some of the different kinds of questions that, like the form essentially of like pressing a button. That's something that you use. What do you think about, like, why do you use that as a tool for getting people to ask questions?
It's neutral because there's like a lot of ways in which the answers to a question will change a lot depending on like the very specifics of the framing. And I've tried this before with series of Twitter polls where I'll ask the same essential question, but I will change like very minor details around it. Like, do you have to press a button or do you have to walk across the street and like push someone over? Like, you know, but the outcome is the same. And it's, so I try and have like a stable, neutral middle ground that I use for most of the questions to try and keep it like kind of even. And that is the button pressing. Because like a button pressing, it is an action that you have to do. It's not like a negation action or like a lack of action, as in like you have to actually perform an action, but it's also extremely minimal. So that combination is my favorite.
Are there other techniques that you use?
Yeah, there's the Demon Child series. So how did it go? It, like behind one door, there's a demon is about to like do something horrible, and over here a child is about to die, and you can only like save the child or you can go and stop the demon, but not both. So that's another one that I really like, that you can like push a whole bunch of things into that series to like, what is the worth of a child really? There's also a series of like distance. So I tested like a distance question. So how far away from a child do you have to be before you are morally obligated to save its life? And like the percentage of people who will answer, yes, you are morally obligated to save the child's life, like increases the closer you get to the child and decreases the farther away you get.
Interesting. So what is this revealing to you about people? What does this tell you about how we think about things, and like how groups work or how people approach different moral questions? Do you have any grand takes on that?
Yeah, I think that people have some sort of like system of operation that they use, and it's extremely complicated, and it relies on a whole bunch of like tiny little rules that are like conditional on other things. But this is subconscious, right? Like you can't write a book about like the rules in which you operate, and instead we use like labels which we stick onto our extremely complicated operating system as like a general approximation of what we do. And so the thing that I'm really interested in is revealing the separation between like the actually like, extremely complex system and the label. So we'll say, yes, this is moral, but then if we like tweak it, we can see the ways in which it like peels off away from the way we actually operate. And I think this is fine. This makes sense. Like we have to sort of have simplistic rules of operation if we're going to describe what we're doing, because it's impossible to actually describe the kind of rules we're operating on.
Yeah. Rothgar, do you have anything to add to that?
I was really I really enjoyed that description. I'm not sure I have anything to add immediately.
Great.
Yeah.
Whoop. So, cool. How did you like parse down this deck? So like popular demand, like effective use in games, ones that you found to be your favorites. How did you get from 1,000 to 125?
We did the system together, Rutger and I. I had a huge spreadsheet list, and then we went down, we ranked it, right? We each went down and put our own number, like on a scale from 1 to 7. And then we weighted our own rankings pretty high. And then we had, I think, 20 friends or something go through and rate all of the questions themselves. And these questions were already selected from the top most commented or liked, retweet, commented on Twitter, as well as the ones that you can't really tweet, the ones that are open-ended as opposed to closed. Yeah. So we had that filtration system initially, and then we had a ranking system, and then we went through and after we like averaged all of the scores, we manually sort of tweaked some things we liked and didn't like, and also took the top 25 questions from each category. So we had to categorize each of all of those questions, which there were a lot of them, and then we took the top 25 from each category. Does that sound right? Did I miss anything, Rothgar?
That sounds right. It was really fun putting this together. I remember your parents also ranking the questions, and
Totally forgot.
yeah, it really matters. The specific phrasing really matters for how people end up interpreting a thing. Yeah, so there are examples of questions. I don't know if I have an example right now where if you phrase it one way, just in a conversation, the conversation will die, and then phrased slightly differently, it generates a huge lively discussion. So it's cool to tune into that.
Yeah, that's super interesting. Do you have like a working hypothesis as to like why that happens, or what kinds of like asking what questions versus like who questions or anything like that? It just seems like that's a theme, that the framing, like the specific ways that the question is being asked, like engenders either possibility or it closes off possibility.
So one very general rule is that yes or no questions tend to be more dead ends than other kinds of questions. And it's usually possible to reframe a yes or no question in a more open way. Mm-hmm. That's the one thing that comes to mind.
There's also questions that are good to listen to. So this was one criteria that like we had to figure out over time, that you can't just ask questions which people love to answer. You have to ask questions that people love to listen to other people answer. Is so much more important, and that will cause an actual conversation, because then people like really want to hear what's going on. Whereas there's a lot of questions out there that are so much fun to just answer yourself, but will kill any sort of momentum collectively. And so we did have to like pry out some of those questions from the deck, because we really liked them, but they just aren't good for groups.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. That's really interesting. Yeah, there's definitely lots of questions that for yourself that would be great, but for other people, because you're almost, questions like bring out stories in people and bring out like novelty. Like I found myself answering questions in this deck and not knowing my answer beforehand. And there's something kind of that puts you on your edge when you are in front of people, especially answering a question that you don't have a working hypothesis for. You're just free form. It's cool.
Yeah, that's one more thing is, we tried to include only questions that people wouldn't have cached answers for. That's really important. And specifically, it's even better to have questions where every time you hear the question, your answer is going to be different. Mm-hmm. So if you develop an answer one time, it's not going to hold for the next time you hear the question. That's not true for all of them, but we aspire for that to be the case.
Excellent. Great. And I guess just before we move to the question and answer period with the audience, can you tell us what's next for Askhole? Is there anything on the horizon?
Yes. Askhole number 2.
Askhole number 2.
Yep.
You want to give us a little juicy secret about what's coming?
Well, it's just Askhole number 2. It's just another 125 questions.
Cool.
Yeah, but we are still in the process of selecting questions right now. We have a very large list, same deal. So if anybody is interested in going down and ranking how much you like questions, we are always looking for more people to do that. So that would be great.
Can they contact you through askhole.io?
Yeah, the Askhole thing. Just ask, like, hey, I'm down to rate questions, and then we'll give you a spreadsheet, and then you just put your name in, and then you just like put in however many numbers you feel like putting in.
Yeah, there's also a web version of the game on the website, which is what we're going to be using in the following hour when we're going to play Askhole, and I totally recommend it to everyone. There's also a feature where you can actually submit a question in the website, right? Yeah, so if you have a question that you'd like to see included, you can also include it on the website. So Peter, I hear that you have a question. Would you like to unmute yourself and ask?
Yes, I do have a question. So simply, like, who would you like to see play Askhole? And I was thinking of someone who has stature, an author, maybe an intellectual that you respect in these spaces. I'm thinking like Robin Hanson and Justin Murphy, like those type of people I'd like to see play. So I'm curious, who would you like to see play this game?
I guess the question is like, why do I want to see them play it? Like if I want publicity for the game, that's a different answer. If I'm like, I'm actually don't know how they would answer a lot of these questions, then that's also different. I think probably the person I have the least ability to predict, which I would have to think about that. I couldn't just tell you. Also, Rodgar, feel free to jump in if you have any.
It's a good question. I will have to think about it. When you asked the question, the first thing that popped into my mind was the Pope, just because it's
Nice. It's a good answer.
Yeah.
That would be hilarious. Okay, so David Mick,
Yes,
would you like to ask your question?
I would. Aella, I love your Twitter polls. You remind me a lot of Robin Hanson. I wish I had your courage to ask these questions and just take the heat from all the people that are just bound and determined to misinterpret or your intent or project their own insecurities or sacred cows on you. But my question is, are there any questions that you really like, but you didn't include in Askhole because they are too outside the Overton window, even for you?
There's this one question which is like too far. Rothgar, do you know the one I'm thinking of? No, is it yeah, but it's just more shock value. There's like questions that are more like force you to consider really horrific things.
I can think of one.
Yeah. But if in regards to non-shock value questions, no, I put literally everything in there that I thought had any sort of thing, right? And Rothgar too. Like, I don't think we held back at all. But there's definitely some really like gross out horror ones that we didn't put in.
Maybe you need a new category for the Askhole too.
Ooh.
The diarrhea section.
Yeah. Questions that we're not going to ask on the STOA. Yeah.
I don't know. STOA might be the right place. Great. Thank you, David. So Travis, would you like to ask your question?
Yeah, I hope it's not too windy over here. So what role did your experiments with acid play in the development of the questions? And did a majority of the questions come during trips, soon after trips, or during periods of like relative abstinence? And is there any correlation between like the mind altering properties of the drug and the types of questions that you ask?
I like that question. So Rothgar had an idea to actually make a deck called the acid deck, and it's for reading the questions while you are tripping. And we do actually have a plan to do this. It's probably going to be like maybe after another deck or two, but acid questions, though, the questions that you come up with on acid that are really meaningful for you on acid are like not like easily generalizable to people who are not on acid. So I don't know if how many here have like experience, but a lot of it's like what are you afraid of? It's like a very general question. It might not generate great conversation, but it would be like a great rabbit hole to start thinking of. So no, Acid didn't really give me these questions. Acid gave me a lot of different questions, which were really useful, but not great for parties. But the general philosophy, right, of like question everything, like if there is a thing that you haven't looked at, like go look at it and like figure out. I think there's a lot more skill in figuring out the right question to ask for yourself than there is to answer it. Like if you can figure out the question to ask, then you have a direction to move. And if you don't know the question to ask, but you're full of answers, then you're stagnant. So I think like that philosophy of like the question is the movement and not necessarily the answer, it really like lends itself to the philosophy of Askhole.
Excellent, thank you. It's a great question. Michelle, do you want to unmute yourself and make your suggestion?
Sure. Hi. I'm so fascinated by this idea that you were talking about around there are questions that people themselves really love to answer, but that other people don't like hearing them answer. So I just love to hear some examples of that. I've heard people talking about their own dreams as something, for example, that people really love to talk about, but others hate to listen to. I'm wondering what the questions examples are, other examples.
Yeah, so things that don't have good narrative arcs are one. So anything that has to do with like facts about your life. So any sort of exposition. So like, what is your favorite X, or where did you live when X? So that sort of thing, people can really, it feels like meaningful to your identity. Be like, yes, that time I lived in Paris, right? Like I'm a person that lived in Paris, but like nobody gives a shit because it's not a part of like a meaningful narrative arc. So like a lot of those sorts of things, like what's the most interesting thing that you ever did when you were a teenager? Like people tend to zone out when it comes to stuff like that. Also things that are slow introspection. So things that are like, where are you in your life? What are you looking for? And I mean, I think you can do it well if you are extremely careful about the phrasing. But there's a lot of like, man, I don't know if I really should be going for this job promotion that other people just aren't. It's not like exciting to hear you like weighing a whole bunch of like tiny options that are relevant to you and no one else. So things that are like either like too zoomed in or too zoomed out tend to sort of just pass on by other people.
Thank you. So interesting.
Thank you. Miriam, would you like to share your question?
Yeah. So you had 1,000 questions. You boil it down to 150, but clearly they're like these are rank ordered. That's how you narrowed it down to 150 in the first place. So what were like the top 2 or 3 that just really get the party going?
Do you remember what the winners were, Rothgar? We could probably pull up the spreadsheet. We have it somewhere.
Yeah, I was about to actually pull it up and we can give you the real answer to that.
Yeah, do you want to pull it up really fast? But I think they were all sad. The sad questions dominated the lead.
Interesting. Why do you think that is?
If it bleeds, it leads.
Yeah. I think it's the kind of connection that people maybe are most hurting for is like to be seen in their pain. And like a lot of other things are fun, but I think like the connection in the pain is like the thing. It's like the most important thing. And I think that's why that the sad won.
Cool.
How's it going, Rothgar?
All my bandwidth is being taken up by this Zoom call, so it might.
Yes. Well, we will just keep on going with the questions in the chat, and if you find the spreadsheet, we'll circle back to that. So we have a question. Oh.
Read off a few.
Oh no.
The top
We have Robot Man.
are.
We didn't hear you.
Okay. Oh.
You're really choppy.
Okay, I'm trying again. How about now?
That's better.
Yeah.
Okay. So the top questions that we had are, what emotion are you currently suppressing or ignoring? What was the most significant thing you've ever changed your mind about? In what ways don't you trust yourself? In what ways are you inhibited from expressing love? And what experience, though difficult or painful, would you recommend to everyone? Those are the top 5.
That's awesome. Thank you. I got a really popular question here in the chat from Daniel. Daniel, would you like to ask this question?
Sure. So one thing I've noticed with really curious people is that they tend to be very cerebral, not all the time, but a lot of intellectually curious people spend a lot of time in the realm of the abstract. And so I'm always curious about, how do you ask questions in such a way, or what sort of questions get cerebral intellectual types to speak more from their body as opposed to from their head?
$1 million question, isn't it? If I knew the answer to that, I would be extremely happy. But so I don't think we've optimized for that super strongly in the deck, but I know what you're talking about. There's like questions that bring you back to the level of sensation. So there's a couple questions that say, like, away from your conscious response in the gut, how do you feel about X? And so that's one technique. Another is to avoid cached responses, like we mentioned earlier. Like, if you're really smart, probably you've thought about all the things before, and to like be able to throw someone off, like to put them in their mind into a spot that hasn't been before, usually that can be a little bit more genuine. I don't think those answers are really that excellent, because I think the problem is a very hard one.
No easy answers, Daniel.
Fair
Philip.
Hey.
Philip, would you like to ask your question?
Yeah, sure. Hey guys. So my thought is, since you spend a lot of time thinking about the taxonomy of questions and like different properties that questions can have, do you find yourself noticing the types of questions that different people ask? Or like, do you put people into like categories or bins based on like, oh, like this type of person like asks me these types of questions all the time?
Yes. Maybe not like quite as like categorized as maybe I would hope. But I think I mainly noticed like the frequency of questions to answers that people give. That's like the number one, maybe even like outside of the question realm, just in general, the thing I pay attention to in people is like, how much time do they spend like inquiring versus like providing the answer to? And I think that tells you a huge amount about a person. In regards to like types of questions, there's obviously the dichotomy of like very simple, where are you from, versus something that's unusual. But beyond like those two spectrums, I can't say that I like actually have a better developed model for that. But what about you, Rothgar?
Yeah, I'm now just thinking about the ways that one could classify questions at all. I think for me, there's some measure of the depth of a question, of how far down it seems to reach into just experience itself. So some questions definitely feel more like surface level, just like what is this concept referring to, or something. And then some questions feel really, really deep, and maybe there's a thing where people tend to be of a certain level of depth in their inquiry about something. That's the first thing that came to mind.
Okay, we have a question from Ann John. Sorry if I'm mispronouncing your name. Would you like to ask your question?
Yeah, my question is, I'm wondering, have you noticed in your own life any changes in the type of questions you ask, having done this whole process?
Yeah, I'm more easily bored at this point. I don't really ask many of the Askhole questions anymore, because I've asked them so many times. I'm shifting slowly towards trying to ask questions from like my physical body as opposed to like my mind. I'm becoming more curious about like the way that it feels to be in the presence of another person, and asking questions that try to like let me feel that more clearly, as opposed to like how do we like analyze, you know, where our philosophical positions lie. Although I do still like doing that quite a lot, but that's definitely has been the shift away from like a sort of an analytical thing more towards a like a sensational thing.
What about you, Rothgar?
I would agree with that. Something similar about the being, let's see, I'm more able to intuit appropriate questions in different contexts. And there's something about viewing a question as a tool and then being able to sort of just come up with the right tool for the job. And that's really cool, because I think I almost want there to be a science of inquiry. I think it's potentially really important. Of what are questions? What are they doing? What happens in the moment that you hear a question? What is it doing? And then if you've ever played this game, maybe it's just called Questions, where it's like an improv game where you're only allowed to respond with a question back and forth. So taking that really seriously is cool. It results in a different state of mind if you take it seriously and you're asking genuine questions.
Yeah, definitely. That feels really alive for me, like the science of inquiry. What is a question doing? And how come people can feel so offended just by a question? I think that's... Yeah, Aella, you probably have a lot more to say about that than I do.
I'm on the shocked side of that. Yeah.
Yeah, just by pausing a question, like in some cases, you know, I see people respond to your polls and they're like, how could she even ask this question? You're like, what's wrong with that? What's wrong with even posing a question into the world? They're so provocative. They have the possibility of being so enlivening for people. And it's just a question mark at the end of I guess it's more than that. It's more than that.
Yeah. This is a huge thing. Like, I don't know how many of you like are up on the Twitter thing, but there have been several times where the Twitter mob has like brigaded me horribly for days of hate for literally just a question. Like, I think I asked a question about bestiality a couple of months ago. Just like how did we evolve out of liking animals or something? Not that we did, but like, where did that come from? That was a mistake.
Greg, would you like to unmute yourself and ask your question?
Yeah, I actually wrote my question just before Hrothgar said the phrase science of inquiry, so that was kind of a funny lead in, and I'm just going to read what I wrote out loud. It seems like you're informally doing social psychology research in a sense. Have you studied any social psychology or other academic research, either to help you interpret your findings or just out of curiosity to see how what you've observed compares to the science?
No,
okay.
Not at all. I started doing this originally because I was originally doing porn, and I had a large following of people who were masturbating to me, and I was like, they're going to do things I say, I can ask them questions. So I, like, way back in the day, started doing surveys on all of these men, and eventually found that I had a whole bunch of data that I didn't know what to do with, and then eventually found a friend to help like teach me some statistics and like what p-values were and stuff like that. So I'm not like incredible at it, but I have like some basic knowledge, but that's the entirety of my education.
Okay.
Great. First principles. We have 2 people raising hands, which is not something that usually happens, but Cara, do you want to tell us about your hand raising?
Yeah, I was talking to the point about why people might get offended by a question.
Mm-hmm.
And just in general, from my own gut check, when you ask a question, it says more about you than it does about how the response does about the person who's responding. So like how you're framing the question is a social code. It's a social signal to another person that indicates your own boundaries, and that sometimes you can cross a person's boundary by asking a question. I mean, often you can cross a person's social boundary just by existing. So I think that it really is just a difference in how people have been raised. Some people were raised to never ask questions, that whole be seen and not heard thing.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean,
Yeah.
now obviously things are different, but yeah, that was kind of what I was going for. And I don't have access to chat, so I couldn't.
Ah, I see.
Yeah.
That explains it. Well, thank you. Aella, do you have anything to say in response to that?
Yeah, I mean, that seems right. Like, I think the people that get upset at the questions are doing it because they're like interpreting it as like a threat in some way, that like they're pattern matching like this series of words onto other people who have used those as war in the past, which makes sense. I think you're totally right about that, Kara.
Great. And then we have Miriam. Would you like to ask your question?
Yeah, so talking about this willingness to even answer a question, this whole Askhole game reminds me of the work of Jonathan Haidt, who investigated universal moral foundations. And he would go around asking very uncomfortable questions and then cataloging the types of responses. But in this case, it seems like we could open up a new area of research to catalog who is even willing to answer and what personality characteristics guide that behavior. I think this is like a new sphere of inquiry. So not a question.
Yeah, I think that's interesting. I think that a lot of people will answer the question without answering the question. So you can even get people to like engage, but if you just pay attention, you realize they're not actually giving an answer. And I think like that probably is really indicative of something. I think you're right.
Great. And we have a question from Rachel.
Hi. So I got offended at one of your tweets, and then I read your responses, and I just became a huge fan. So thank you for doing what you do. Thank you. Love you. Okay, so my question is, as somebody who is in the sex worker community, that associates with us heretics, you know, and that's more involved in like the harder rationalist, analytical side of things, how are you treated by the more mainstream women in the sex worker community?
Not well at all. I've been blacklisted from a lot of sex worker groups because they think that I am a racist and homophobe, like all the words that people say when they're mad at you. Yeah, so generally not well at all. I think I have some sort of like animosity towards them in response for that. Like I'm mad that sex workers aren't more open-minded. Like, you should be open-minded, you're a sex worker, but it doesn't seem to be the case.
Great, thank you. And let's see, what else we got here? Do you mind if we pull a question from the deck and you answer it? Do you have a category of preference?
Sure, can we just randomize?
Yeah, I'll like randomize this. And then maybe you tell me when. I'll close my eyes. Okay. They're mixed up all over my desk.
Yeah, I have like a little box for mine.
Smart. Yeah, your tiny box is a little too tiny. Okay, here we go. Question number 86. Do you believe the set of concepts like duty, should, obligation, and deserving are ultimately more valid or meaningless?
Yeah, meaningless. They're like an incomplete term. You know how sometimes you have terms, I'm gonna try and make this short. I can feel myself starting to talk a lot. But like when I was religious, I believed in these words that seemed real, like like a theological word like the hypostatic union, for example. And this was very real to me. And then once I left the faith, I realized that it was a word that actually wasn't attached to anything, but it was useful in the context. And so I think like moral duty, etc., are also a set of concepts that are like useful in the sort of religious framework of morality, but like ultimately don't actually mean anything. It's just wind. Rothgar?
Yeah, Rothgar.
Okay. Wait, can you repeat the question just so I know all the words in it?
Totally. Do you believe the set of concepts like duty, should, obligation, and deserving are ultimately more valid or meaningless?
So I guess I'll take the other position just so we have an interesting contrast. I think there's a sense in which those concepts are referring to something that's very real. And it might not be real in the way that is originally understood. So certainly if there's a should or a duty or an obligation, it's a felt thing. So when I have a should, it's very felt as a force that's like pushing or pulling me towards something. Probably because I'm afraid of what will happen if it doesn't go the way that the should says it should. But then we get into a territory where we're talking about sort of how morality is based in sensation or something rather than like the moral code who are satisfying God or something. Yeah.
Interesting. Any response, Aella?
That's like a large rabbit hole. I don't think I want to do this right now.
Okay, yeah, definitely. We've only got like about 10-ish more minutes. Let's see if there's any really like biting questions from the chat. And if not, I will just pick another question and we'll keep going. Oh, we do have a follow-up question to the sex worker question. Grace, would you like to ask your question?
Yeah, like I'm wondering how you made sense or how you make sense of the other sex workers targeting you.
I like how simple that question was. I like how like it was very concise and like just the right level of vague. I try and think of it as demographics. It's like what makes sex workers more likely, or at least like the same amount of likely. Maybe I'm just more exposed to them, and so I'm more likely to experience pushback from any group that I'm more exposed to. So it's possible that this is not unique to sex workers at all. But if it is, then like my theory, I'm going to read the chat thing, is that like sex workers tend to like require like more intense social signaling in some way, or like more intense in-group circling because like they're subject to like such pressures. And they also seem to be like really liberal. And I don't really have anything against liberalism in general, but there's like a kind of brand of liberal that feels very like identity driven and very performative. And it seems to me that like the sex workers I've encountered tend to be more in that direction. Like they tend to be more performatively liberal, which might make sense because like it aligns with the sort of the ideology of sex work, which I am very pro, obviously. So I'm not, so me making sense of it is usually just trying to think of like, what are the reasons for why it happens to be like this selection seems to not like me.
Yeah. Can I just follow up on that?
Yeah, of course.
So I understand you're trying to make sense of why they're targeting you. Is that what I'm hearing?
I think so.
And so I'm wondering, have you made any sense from it? Do you understand? What is your understanding of why they would do it? I missed that. Maybe I missed it. Sorry.
So I mean, there's like a slightly different question between why do people get upset at me in general, and that's a slightly different answer than why are sex workers tending to get mad at me. And it's possible that those two answers overlay a lot. So like, for example, people get upset at me is because they like interpret my questions as meaning a thing that they don't, for example. And it's possible that this is the explanation that explains why sex workers don't like me, also like 90% of it. Does this answer what you're saying, or is it a different thing?
Yeah, what I'm hearing is you're trying to make sense of it, and you're trying to help me understand your sense making of it. That there isn't a black and white binary answer here.
That's correct.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you for that question, Grace. And let's see here. Is there anything that you all really want to share with us about Askhole, like things that you've come to understand by endeavoring on this process? I mean, anything that comes to mind, this would be a great time to share that. Silence, non-starter. The wrong phrasing,
so
potentially.
You gotta hit that sweet middle ground.
I know, it's too broad.
Yeah, I've only played it a couple times, usually on the Socratic speed dating sessions, but I've really enjoyed it when I played it, and I think it brings out a side of people that you don't usually see.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like this fun but more personal alternative to something like Cards Against Humanity, which is just fun and silly kind of thing. This is more like, let's cut into the soul and see what comes out. Yeah, I enjoy that aspect of it, and I look forward to experiencing more of it. And I'm definitely looking forward to Askhole 2 whenever that comes out.
Yay! You have some fans here at the Stoa.
This is so nice. I'm really thrilled to see so many people who feel so like-minded to like what I'm doing, and all of you seem to be like really down for the same sort of approach, and that's really heartwarming.
Great. And okay, so let's see here. I'm going to ask you one more last question, and then we'll wrap up the session, and we will move on to actually playing Askhole, which everybody is totally invited to join us for this for the second hour here. How about this one? On planet A, everyone's 30% dumber, and you're a genius by comparison. On planet B, everyone's 30% smarter, and you're an idiot by comparison. You stay the same. Which planet would you prefer to live on?
I hate this question. This is one of my least favorite questions.
Great.
It's just horrible. It's horrible to think about, and it's not fair to other people that we've put this in the deck. Rothgar, can you go first while I think about the answer?
Yeah, I think I'd rather be an idiot. I find that over time, I try to surround myself more and more with people who are really smart. And so planet, whichever one it was, A or B, the one where I'm an idiot seems like a natural extension of that. And as long as, like, granted that I can get over my own problems with feeling stupid, which seems possible, then that would be a great planet to be on. And also assuming that the people who live there aren't assholes, which is not in the question.
Yeah, that's true. Smartness and not being an asshole are two different things.
Yeah, it really feels like the trade-off is between, like, can you handle the emotional hit of being the stupidest? For, I don't know, if a world where everybody was 30% smarter sounds really great. Like, things would get fixed and run smoother. We'd have fewer problems. So that's the trade-off. And I think I want to be the person that takes the being stupid. And I don't know if I actually am that person. It's hard to tell because I'm blinded by desire.
Great, honest answer. Great. Okay, well, let us begin wrapping up here. Thank you so much, Aella and Rothgar. This was amazing. I've been so excited to talk to you both about this, and I'm so glad we could make it happen.
Thank you for putting it on. You're really good at this.
Yeah,
and also very good questions, too.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you to the audience for all your excellent questions and for engaging with this conversation today. And I invite all of you to come play Askhole. Great. So we're going to finish up here with the recording. Before we do, Daniel, would you like to talk about the event that's happening later on today, the Dark Stoa?
Sure. So we're having a pretty intense session at the Dark Stoa tonight, which is his weekly series being run by Pat Ryan, who's the most dangerous man on the internet. And he's talking about the topic of blackmail. And I promise there will be a very unnerving mic drop moment at some point in tonight's event. So if you want to get mildly horrified, then sign up for that. It's at 8:30 Eastern tonight.
Yes, so that'll be just right after the game of Askhole. Wonderful. And then next week here at the Stoa, we've got some really exciting names. We're going to have Daniel Schmachtenberger here. We're going to have Benjamin Boyce. We're going to have Joe Brewer, Christopher Life from One Nation. So stay tuned for the events for next week. And we'll just say that the Stoa operates on a gift economy. And if you feel inspired to give us a gift, you can visit us at thestoa.ca. And also, please, you can visit Askhole at askhole.io. And thank you all so much for being here today.
Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. All right, Peter, you can cut the recording.